Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. I'm producer Caleb, and I'm joined by Drs. Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, and Adam Francisco. Today, we're kind of hitting the end of our apologetics series, maybe not the complete end, but we're wrapping things up. We're going to call this episode the What Now episode. Over the last several weeks, we've gone over the various evidences for Christianity, the historical method, many other apologetic methods. We talked about some of the philosophical methods for proving the existence of God and the like. And today we're kind of asking the question, does this matter? What does it all mean? Will you ever be approached with somebody who you can make a difference using these types of things, or is it all just kind of nonsense? Dr. Keith, you have a lot to say about this. You deal with this, I think, in the classroom a lot, correct?
Yeah, I do. It's actually something that I think about all the time, because not only in the classroom, but as I go around to different churches, and I would guess Adam maybe has a similar experience, you find that you're called out by church leaders to give a presentation on some apologetic topic, and people show up, people don't show up, whatever. I'm sure at Adam's he always gets hundreds, but and you give your presentation.
This space?
That's right. Yeah. You give your presentation, and oftentimes when I'm done, I even wonder sort of, what now? Is there, in the world in which we live, as you're trying to prepare all these people to go give a defense, is there an opportunity when it feels like we're so assailed, and that not even just the Christian claim itself, but just claims in general are under attack. The idea that I could be talking about something that is true and worth defending is completely under attack in our culture, or that you could, or that anybody could. That's even possible. And myself, I even often wonder, what now? In class, it happens all the time. I'd say that we rely heavily on Dr. Montgomery and his work and the apologetic sort of training and tasks that we undertake. But his apologetic was really written, in a sense, to counter or to answer intellectual objections to the faith. And many of the objections that I face when I'm evangelizing or just teaching a class are not intellectual of the sort that are refutable with sort of an academic response. They're more like nothing matters, right? Yeah. Which you can go at philosophically and theologically, but it's just kind of different.
But you're starting at a different place than you would
right.
with evidential apologetics.
So one of the things that I talk about quite a bit is this idea that I think, especially the youngsters these days, sort of operate as though they're not using some sort of epistemology, some sort of way of knowing. And in fact, I think many would say that there is no way of knowing.
Sure.
And so one of the places I often start in the what now, why does it matter, is, in a sense, kind of first convincing them that you do operate with a way of knowing, that we all do. Mm-hmm. And it's just, from that point, it's just a matter of determining what way of knowing actually gets you to some sort of truth that you can rely on. And, the statements of analytic, synthetic and nonsensical really, I think, play into that eventually.
Well, I think of Jim Sires' book, Why Believe Anything at All?
That's what I start with. I start with some diagrams out of Sires' book, Why Believe Anything at All?
Yeah.
And he makes a great argument for we all believe something, right? And he even puts his different reasons why we all believe something. He's got, his sociological reasons, psychological reasons, religious reasons, all that type of thing. But is it, Adam, when you go out, do you see this kind of thing, or is this just me?
Well, I see it quite a bit, not so much when I go do a talk on apologetics or what have you, but among my students. Not so much our history majors. We beat it out of them pretty quickly, any sort of relativism.
Well, I guess
that's godly.
The question would be, how do you beat it out? Unless it's literally, how do you beat it out of them?
No, it's a metaphorical beating. Well, from a historian's viewpoint, if everything is relative, if history is a construct and so on and so forth, there's no point in talking about anything.
Yeah.
Because ultimately everything boils down to a construct. And why should I listen to yours when you can construct something else the next day? And everything just it becomes solipsistic.
Yes.
So we do it kind of an argument, reducing relativism to absurdity, to emphasize that if you're going to hold to some sort of relativism, you're basically in a world that just is not hard and fast, a world that it doesn't have facts, and it's ultimately, and here's where kind of postmodern philosophy, if there's one thing we could say about it, is if they're right, if everything is relative, everything's about power.
Yes. Does that make any sense to them?
Yes, it does. At least my students, it does make a lot of sense, and so there is learning, whether it's historical or otherwise. It's not just for the sake of learning. That's important to be sure, and that's noble. But there's a political, a civil, and ethical side to it as well. In civil society, if everything really is relative, I think of the Nuremberg trials.
Sure.
If everything is relative, there's no way you can describe those who perpetrated the Holocaust as bad.
Yep. That has to go.
So that's kind of how I do it. I do run into every once in a while in talks, especially at universities when I'm doing something not at where I teach, but like a public university. There will be that relativist who just says, "What's the whole point?" I've had some people say, "You're defending Christianity as if it's backed up by facts. Why would you do that?" I've had that question several times. Well, how else am I to do it? And as we get into a conversation, their point is more often than not, there might be facts, but facts don't speak for themselves. Everything's an interpretation of facts. So ultimately it is a construct, or it's a perspective, or what have you.
Right.
And the way you take that down is just through reduction to absurdity.
Right.
That if we're going to follow this, everything is just absurd, and
Yeah.
there's no point.
I start with, I don't know if it's absurdity. I start with practical. Like, I ask them things like, how did you get here today? Well, I drove here in my car. Well, when you walked down to your car, did you think it was going to start? Yeah, I thought it was going to start. Why did you come to that conclusion? And eventually they get to, well, I've done this many times and it started. I'll even go to like learning how to cross the street. At one point, how did you learn it was safe to cross the street? So they taught me to look left, look right, look left again, and I'll point out to them that all you're really doing while you're doing that is evaluating evidence.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
That it's the evidence eventually that you'll base your life on, or that you'll bet your life on by stepping out into the street. And I found that you can have some success with getting to the practical, because eventually even people who believe that they're relativists make decisions in their everyday life.
Yes. Can't avoid it.
Even if they've never sort of thought of those decisions being based on some sort of history. It's very practical. And I think you can take it to things like, okay, so what if I told you I was going to take you somewhere, right? And you said, how are we going to go? And I said, we're going to get there in my car. And you said, how do you know it's going to start? And I can sort of give you the history of all the times I've tried to start my car, and it did in fact start. That type of thing. And I don't know, but to me there's a deeper, angst. It's interesting to me because I think generationally, this generation, and I think there's some good to it, feels a deeper angst about wanting to know why they should believe anything than mine, maybe than previous ones. And I've wrestled with this idea of, is there anything of value in this postmodern movement? And one of the things I think that there is some value in is this idea of questioning. I mean, if you take it at its very core, it's a very academic enterprise. Not to take anything just on face value, but to actually say, I want to know, why you hold that presupposition, or I'm going to distrust your presupposition from the outset. Now, what's not good is the believing that there can be no evidence
for anything
mustered in favor
Yes.
of my position.
Yes.
Do you hit that at all, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many in this so-called postmodern context. People come from so many different perspectives and vantage points, and everything is so subjective and individualized. You get
Right.
so many. You cannot. One thing that's helpful for the apologetic task is realizing that there is. You can do all this study and memorize certain things, but don't expect. Don't bring a canned sort of speech or a canned response to everything, because it's
wide open.
It's wide open.
It's the Wild
never
West
know.
out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And more often than not, the topic we're talking about, is there any meaning, and are facts relevant, and so on and so forth, that actually is becoming more of a conversation than was the tomb empty on Easter morning.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually the conversation might get there, but just, is there any sort of meaning?
Right.
Is it?
Does anything mean anything?
Yeah. And there's a great sort of. People think that nihilism died.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think
Alive and well.
It's just become so normal that we don't talk about it as sort of a unique thing anymore.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Because there's no meaning to anything except for the meaning you assign to it.
Yeah.
Right. It's just not maybe systematized nihilism, right? It's just it's functional.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I remember growing up, so in the 80s, being in youth group, junior high youth group or high school youth group, and we did a lot of study of the New Age movement. Remember the New Age movement?
Sure.
Shirley MacLaine and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
And that was sort of like the big boogeyman at the time.
Yeah, it was actually.
And I don't hear anything about the New Age anymore. Not because it's gone, because it's so pervasive.
Yes.
I mean, my barber talks about the universe speaking tour.
Right.
That's the New Age stuff. Or spirit
Right.
guides and
Right.
All of it.
Jonathan Edwards, not the great revivalist preacher or the awakening preacher, but the guy who talks to dead relatives, who's on Oprah, and I don't watch Oprah. I really don't watch Oprah. But who they can talk to your relatives, and you can know that your
he's a
relatives
medium?
are okay.
He's a
Yeah,
medium?
that's it.
Okay.
I couldn't think of the term.
Yeah, channeling.
Yeah. All that stuff's very common now. Angel guides and all kind of bizarre stuff. That was very odd back then. We don't talk about it because it's just so pervasive. Like nihilism, I think, is everywhere.
It's interesting with the students. I think if I were to walk into the room and say, "Listen, I'm a medium and I speak to spirits, and you can be, and you're a Muslim, and that's okay." Is it the problem with Christianity are the exclusive claims that are made in Christianity? It's not the claim that Christ is God.
Right.
It's the claim that Christ is the God. The
way,
one
the truth,
true
and life.
God, the way, the truth, and life. That's what we've lost, and that's sort of a generic spiritualism is okay. And certainly, I guess this is the difference too. In the 70s, it seems like the attack was on belief of any kind whatsoever, that you were an idiot if you believed in God, period, the end.
Right.
That's certainly not the case anymore. I mean, these kiddos will accept you no matter what you believe, as long as you're not telling them that it's the truth and they ought to believe it too.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you could believe that there's a purple mushroom god that lives in the sky, and as long as you eat a bite of the mushroom every day, you'll be okay. And they'll be like, "Hey, man, that's cool."
Yep.
I could feel that. I could feel your positive energy through that. It's that if I say, "Well, if you don't take a bite of the mushroom every day, you're gonna die too," and they're like, "Whoa," it's kind of like you have to get past this idea they have to get past this idea that exclusive truth claims are a non-starter. And it's
Well, and the reality is that they live, their life as if they are. You use the practical examples, which are always good, crossing the street and driving the car. I think even some of the focus on social justice and things like that proved that they are. You can believe in anything as long as you're not a racist. Is kind of some of the.
I agree with that too.
There are objective things that they would say everybody needs to adhere to. You talked about going back to the Nazis and things like that. There's these tragedies that don't sit with them and they would say are wrong.
Right.
And you have to get them to examine why do you believe that's right?
Yeah.
Why do you
Sure.
not? Yeah.
My
Sure.
question would be: is the way of knowing? So I'm a social justice person, right? And I think that the only really really wrong things are racism or sexism or whatever. What's my way of knowing that?
Sure. It reminds me of co-authored work. Frank Beckwith was one of them, and he took a phrase from Schaeffer, both feet planted firmly in midair.
Yeah, yeah.
And it describes the whole nihilistic generation you're talking about. Because they haven't asked that, as near as I can tell, or don't think about it,
Right.
or it's not mentally worth the time.
Well, and I've said before on this too that I think the primary objection to something like Christianity is the bad idea that it's mostly about we Christians wanting to tell them non-Christians, how much they can drink, who they can sleep with, and all that kind of thing. It has to do with their perception that we're forcing on them our view of right and wrong, which, at the end of the day, we're going to acknowledge the Decalogue and morality and
Sure.
ethics and all that.
Sure.
But that's not what Christianity, that's not Christian. We get to the truth of those right and wrong behavior.
Derivatively.
Yeah, derivatively from Christ.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing, and one of the successes I found is we in the core at the university we have them read Mere Christianity, and C.S. Lewis in Book 1 actually does a very good job of setting forth this idea that we all hold to an objective morality, and when you get people who don't necessarily believe that walking down that path. It's interesting to me how quickly they go to specific examples of what they think you're talking about, right? So they think you're talking about the fact that they're sleeping with their boyfriend or their girlfriend or something like that, and you think, well, no, maybe, but
or both.
Right, we're talking
Yeah.
we're talking higher level here.
Right.
We're talking the fact that it's like Lewis says, it's never been totally okay in any culture for me to go bop your wife over the head with a club and take her as my wife.
Yeah.
That type of thing. If you sort of take it to that, I guess it's hyperbole or just even a higher level, it kind of clicks.
Really?
There's a beginning of
Something happens in the eyeballs.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay.
So
I just did some light work this semester on literary apologetics, and Montgomery identifies it as perhaps the way to fill the void of necessary subjective form of apologetics that can move people from this understanding of rejecting objective reality, and how can we get them from the subjective to the objective, and that perhaps literature provides this bridge. And so C.S. Lewis, as you mentioned, does this quite frequently with story, moving people
Right.
from the subjective to the objective, and story is one of the best ways that you might be able to accomplish that. But again, there's that's the question: is can we move people from the subjective to the
Sure.
objective?
Yeah, and it assumes people read.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, there's a bigger assumption there.
Yes.
These days you can get them to watch YouTube,
movies.
though.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing that the literary apologetic kind of applies to storytelling in any way, and I absorb more TV shows and movies than
Well, I used to use the old Spielberg Amazing Stories. One episode was titled "The Mission," and it's a B-17 that gets a hell shot out of it, and they limp home. I won't talk about the very ending of it, but it's, to use Tolkien's word, it's eucatastrophic.
Yeah, it sure is. I remember that. I think you can actually. I looked that up the other day. Not the other day. The other month. While I was sick. I was sitting on my butt for a long time. But I think you can find that on YouTube.
You can.
Yeah.
The Mission.
The Mission.
Yeah.
And it's in the series from Steven Spielberg decades ago called Amazing Stories.
All right. I think we're going to take our break. When we come back, we'll finish this topic up. We'll maybe get to some more formal categories. But I think it's a good thing for us to think about. We're trying to give our listeners as many tools in the toolbox as we can. But we also want to be honest with them and say that it's difficult out there, especially now that we live in a very pluralistic age. We live in a relativistic age. And we're teaching you to start with the Gospels and the historical person and work of Christ to move forward. You might need to do a little bit of work on the front end on trusting history, trusting propositions at all. So we'll get into more of that after the break.
Welcome to our break. Today we're going to talk about speaking engagements that you can go to. We've talked about some of the major conferences going on here, and we haven't for a long time talked about the Speakers Bureau at 1517 Legacy, which all of the hosts are a part of. And that's because towards the end of the year with the holiday season, Thanksgiving, traveling, churches are definitely busy and things like that. There are kind of less and less speaking engagements going on. But as the year turns, as we approach 2017, there's a lot of things going on in January and February that the listeners of this show will have ample opportunity to perhaps travel a little way to go listen to some of these. Some of these are these big speaking engagements, like what Dr. Keith is doing in February with Give Children Grace, or Giving Children Grace. But there's also some of these smaller engagements that may be in your town or the next town over. So, Dr. Keith, you want to talk about some of what's going on in the next couple months?
Sure. Adam and I are both pretty busy in January, at least 2 weekends out of the month. We're doing things. I'm doing a chapel at Orange Lutheran High School. I don't think our listeners are welcome to just show up to that, though. Probably not.
No.
I'll also be in Jamestown, North Dakota at Victory Lutheran Church. There's get on the website at 1517legacy.com. If you just scroll down, you'll see the different events that's there. There's a couple opportunities if listeners wanted to show up. I think I'm doing a men's retreat, a public event at the church, and then Sunday school the next morning, so they could check that out. That'll be primarily Being Dad and things related to the book Being Dad, Father as a Picture of God's Grace. January 18th, Dr. Francisco will be at Fort Wayne Seminary at the Symposia, and if I'm right, I think he's presenting on Luther and apologetics.
Mm-hmm. I think the title they gave me was Luther's Use of Apologetics, but
Okay.
Terrific.
I'll basically be arguing that apologetics is part and parcel of the Lutheran tradition all the way back to Luther.
Yeah,
It's great, especially when it's at seminary.
good. And then are you doing the same thing at Concordia University, Seward, Nebraska on the 23rd?
So the symposium is more academic, and at the at Concordia Seward, it'll be a little more popular in terms of the presentation style.
I'm glad they invited you.
Is that open to the public, do you know?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, good. So that's on January 23rd, 1:30 p.m. You should see Dr. Francisco there. If you're not going to the symposia, it might be enough just to go watch Adam do his thing with Lutheran apologetics. I'm actually considering flying from Jamestown, North Dakota to Indiana. Lord help me. But we'll see. Then in February, Dr. Francisco is at a men's retreat in Valermo, California. Did you know that? St. Andrew's Abbey. Is that open?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to a monastery.
Yeah, is that open to people, or is
No.
That's a closed system.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then we're on to the last one for February, which is the conference Being Mom and Dad, Giving Kids Grace, which I will be at February 11th, 2017 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We'll be at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Grand Rapids. Our friend David Ruffner, faithful listener and friend of 1517 and Thinking Fellows, is helping us put this together. It's a conference, and at the conference will be myself. I'll be doing a segment on masculinity and the need for men in the church. And then a very popular author, Elise Fitzpatrick, and her daughter, Jessica Thompson, are doing a couple of sessions each on the idea of giving kids grace in the home. And what does it mean to be a Christian parent from a completely, I think, for most people, unique perspective, one that's not oriented around, the addition of many, many different rules into the life of children, but what it means to actually give kids grace in the home. Again, that is called Being Mom and Dad, Giving Kids Grace. You can find that at givingkidsgrace.com. You can also go to 1517legacy.com and see that. It'll be on February 11th, 2017. It's an all-day conference for the most part. There's an opportunity for lunch. If you register, I believe you get a copy of Being Dad and Lisa's and Jessica's book, Give Them Grace. The registration cost is $25, and so for the cost of the registration, you're getting either one or two free books. I'm not sure. I didn't organize this thing, but it's a really good deal. You should check it out, givingkidsgrace.com. And that's what we got going on January and February.
A lot of exciting opportunities. We're going to keep those things posted as we go along in the show, as more speaking engagements get scheduled throughout the year, you can always go to 1517legacy.com and hit the events tab to see what's there. There's some stuff that even way scheduled out into the summer and the fall and things like that that are already up there that you may be interested in to go look at. If you're ever looking for a reason to meet the guys around the table, to talk to them about what they love and about what they do best, these events are priceless.
All right.
All right, so let's continue talking about this. I think at the beginning of the show, we did a really good job setting up the problem. Not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but that's mostly what we did. Is there's some relativism going on here, right, that makes us question whether or not doing apologetics is valuable or works even. And so part of the issue is people don't understand how they know what they know or the fact that they know anything much at all. And Dr. Keith, you write a lot on this. And so I'm going to ask you basically to, in a short period, what are kind of the steps to making somebody realize that there is in fact an epistemology that they use, and besides that they do hold to some sort of universal truth in one form or another?
Yep, it's interesting. I always have to keep in mind that it feels so weird for me to be asked a question like this because I just don't feel like an expert on it at all. I'm not a philosopher. So when I delve into the realm of epistemology, I always want people to know that I am doing it at a surface level from my almost layman's understanding of the field. I don't want anybody to ever get the impression that I think, I'm an epistemological philosopher or anything like that. I'm not. Most of what I know from both Rod Rosenblatt here at the table and reading and listening to Dr. Montgomery. But I do write a lot on it, and the reason I write and when I'm writing, I'm usually in some way, shape, or form just recapitulating what I learned from Dr. Montgomery. And the reason I do is because I think that in his works, there's a message that, again, because of the circumstances of his time, is usually written for one crowd, like for an academic debate. And in our day and age, functionally, another crowd that is just, Joe Schmo plumber needs to hear it in some sort of way, shape, or form. And so the steps, I think, are really initially just to try to have conversations with people where you're pointing out to them that we all operate functionally with a way of knowing something. And that really, like Adam said multiple times in the first part of the episode, it gets pretty absurd pretty quickly if you believe that you don't. I do that through a brief introduction through Sayre's idea on why believe anything at all. And in that book, he points out time and time again that everybody believes something, and he kind of goes through the different reasons and the scales of beliefs and everything. And I use some of that. But then I teach them just generally about some basic philosophical concepts that were very helpful to me when I learned them, like the idea, the difference between rationalism and empiricism, just on the base level. I don't know if I got this from Rod or from someone else, but at some point I came to believe that I think everybody lends towards, probably at birth, leaning either towards rationalism just in the way they think or empiricism. I know in my marriage I can see that for sure. So I always use my marriage as an example in that. And, the more you do that with people and the more you can make the examples real, the easier I think it is for them to say, oh yeah, I can see that. I kind of think, top down rationally, or I kind of think particular instance up to a bigger concept empirically or whatever, and they can
well, that's good. It means the brain cells aren't dead yet,
right? And they can kind of work through that, and I think that's really important because I think those are sort of, at least within the Western world, that's fundamental groundwork of how we think we know generally.
Sure.
And the instances and the people that have helped us work that out, through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
Yeah, surely there's got to be some sort of help that comes from the core. If Socrates talks about the human being as a knowing creature, almost the only knowing creature, I'd think that the core would have been of some help if they're doing that before they get to you or your courses.
My course is one of the first classes they take in the course. So,
sorry.
that's kind of where we do this.
Okay.
But then I take them into, which I don't think is always part of everyone's core experience. I take them to the statements from the analytic philosophers on analytic, tautological kind of knowing, definitional, synthetic.
Any good intro to Phil is going to do it,
Right.
unless they're just antipathetic to the analytic movement.
Yeah, and then the idea of nonsensical language, and walk them through the idea that and Adam's going to speak, I think, hopefully on this a little bit more in a minute, the idea that most religious language is kind of nonsensical in a specific way, right? That those religions make statements that aren't verifiable or falsifiable. And that's sort of what makes them broadly, universally acceptable, right? I can be this and be that because neither statement is verifiable or falsifiable. And then I walk them into the idea that Christianity is unique in the sense that it takes that middle position, that it's based on synthetic statements about things that really happened, that were really recorded, that can really be examined, and that can be shown to be things that actually did occur or did not occur. And walk out from the meaning of the fact that we believe those statements did occur, and we can muster evidence in favor of that, and the meaning of that comes after there. And then I just get into things like material and formal principle, and how do we know in theology specifically, which is probably for another show. But I think it's, I guess all I want to get at here is it's really important to at least attempt to introduce people to the bigger ideas, especially if they're unfamiliar with them, and attempt to do so in a way that is understandable to where they are. And very often it's just remedial, and you can use particular, very everyday style examples to get them there. So,
it's the synthetic, if you will, nature of Christianity that, just in terms of real practical stuff, lends to Christianity sort of a posture that can have these sorts of conversations. I know Christianity is, and those of everybody who knows Luther's Bondage of the Will, he says Christians delight in assertions. Christianity is an assertive religion. I know that, but spend time with somebody who has a very circular worldview, and a worldview that they regard as self-evidently true. And if you're like me, you get real tired very quickly at how overly assertive they are. There is no conversation to be had. It's a monologue. At least if your view of Christianity is sort of or your approach is inductive, you can have that conversation. And you're dabbling in a world of probability, not of certainty, where most people are in the realm of probability. So I think this approach we've been advocating, this evidential, inductive approach, in terms of the posture of the apologetic, is very apropos to today. Where
I mentioned at the beginning of one of our shows, I was amazed when the door was open to the science trained, not closed.
You spend a lot, like in our world, where we spend a lot of time with lots of different Christians, those who are, maybe we'll call them fundamentalists or whatever you want to call them. It's you can't get a word in edgewise with those types of people, whether they be fundamentalist Christians or fundamentalist atheists or what have you, because everything's settled. And the synthetic approach says, hey, we're just asserting this because this is the evidence we see. Let's talk about the evidence.
Right.
Do you find it at all, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really need an answer to this. Do you find it all sort of obstructive how assertive science has become? Does that make any sense?
I think the new atheist movement, and though that's kind of dwindled a bit, you still have that sort of scientism.
It really is.
And by assertive, I mean making too many universal assertions that are beyond the scope of the observable evidence.
A contemporary example of this would be Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, I think is the title. It came after his God delusion, and the beginning of it, he says, in this book, I'm going to prove that a Darwinian conception of biological evolution is hard as nails fact. And he
Gets an A for guts.
he gets through the end of the book and he hasn't proved it. I mean, he's shown that there's variation within species,
Yeah.
but that's a long ways away from
Sure.
Species mutating into a new
Right.
species.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what I mean by overly assertive.
Yeah.
Making claims that they cannot be shown to be true on the basis of
Right.
evidence. Yeah.
And behind it, everybody talks about the narrative these days,
Of course.
behind it is that there is a narrative out there that tells us what is acceptable discourse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you don't...
yeah, and if you don't follow the narrative, you're not included at the table.
There's a sociologist who wrote a book. Well, he came up with the notion. He's Robert Bella, I think is his name.
Uh-huh.
And he has this. He came up with this term, plausibility structures, and he talks about society. As society moves along, there are just these certain paradigms.
Yep.
These narratives that sort of set the boundaries of the discourse that you can have.
Uh-huh.
And if you're wanting to talk about something that doesn't fit within those boundaries, you're not even welcome at the table. So I run up within those who we might describe as people who hold a worldview of scientism. I run up against that quite a bit.
Sure.
Or I have in the past. Yeah, that's frustrating.
Back in my day, it was Carl Sagan. Earlier time.
I think it's the
but that's
majority.
what it
today.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the guy who did the show Cosmos,
Yep.
right?
Right, yeah,
Where
yeah.
he starts from the beginning.
Yep.
Nature is all there. The cosmos is all there is, was,
Yep.
and ever shall be.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
how would you know something like
Well, that
that?
sounds
unless
like
you
a- it
can
sounds like a
climb
religious
outside of the
assertion.
cosmos and view it.
Yeah,
Sure.
it sounds like a religious assertion unto itself.
Of course.
It's
Yeah.
a
Of course.
hugely metaphysical
Yeah.
Sure.
assertion.
Sure.
I don't run into this problem at Concordia University, Irvine so much, but out there in the realm of public discourse. And you see it I see it in movies, I see it in books,
Sure.
articles and magazines and so on.
Sure.
And it's just a parallel to sort of the discourse of like real hardcore fundamentalism that doesn't budge. Or on the
That's
other
right.
side, liberalism that doesn't budge.
Sure. 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 I think one of the possibilities, if Christian schools are at all sane, would be that we would represent one of the few islands of where there's still honest discourse to the atheist world. If you want to have a genuine discussion instead of a yelling match, you might want to go over to those Christians because they still converse.
I hope that's still true. I really do.
Yeah.
I won't make a lot of comments on it,
Right.
but I really hope that that's still the case. Honest discourse is, if we're confident that when we say Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, we should be willing to have honest discourse with those who disagree.
Yeah.
Because we're confident that it's true.
Sure.
And that we can defend the truthfulness of our position.
Yeah.
I used to say Christianity is great because it does provide comfort. The gospel brings great comfort, but that's not why we believe it.
You're right.
We believe it first and foremost because it's true in sort of a normal sense of the term.
Yep.
And I used to get a lot of grief with
Yeah.
that from a certain crowd because that shifted that was unacceptable discourse, if you will. Now we're talking in epistemic terms. We're not just talking sort of a circular type of theology. I hope it's true. Like you, I hope it's still true of us.
Yeah, I do too.
We're the type of people that people can talk
It-
with. And I think it is true.
It is really promising if the Christian world, or a large portion, or a portion of the Christian world, represents what was a precursor to our universities, those cathedral schools before the universities got rolling. But it was where Western civ was still respected, and you could have conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. The whole So before, say, 12th, 13th century, as the scholastic era of medieval Christianity is getting rolling, there's people asking bizarre questions.
Sure.
Even a guy like Thomas Aquinas, who's the great theologian of the Catholic tradition, can ask a question like, how do we know God exists?
Right.
In the Middle Ages, where
Right.
it would probably be dangerous to ask such a question, but he's wanting to know.
Yep. Right.
There's a noticeable turn from towards more of an epistemological disposition, where it's not skepticism; they're just wanting to know how we know these sorts of things.
We know it's true. Now, how can we verify that? How can we know that? How can we explain its truthfulness? To others? Yeah, yeah. This is the exact conversation I had the other day.
And this has, and
university.
here it's. I think we're all on the same track. We're talking objective, not subjective.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So as we wrap up, Caleb pointed out that I've done some writing on this. I have on 1517 tried to do a couple of very short articles. I think they're each 1,000 words or less, explaining these ideas of how do we know, can we trust historical accounts of miracles, what is truth. And Caleb will put those up in the show notes. One is just, again, can historical accounts of miracles be trusted? Caleb will put that up in What is Truth, which goes through analytic, synthetic, and nonsensical statements.
Here, again, for the young or for the older, it's worth it to, in some way, have walked through an intro to Phil. A quality one.
I agree. I mean, I could not agree more.
Just the basics, and especially the chapter on do we know anything and how do we know we know.
Right. Yeah. That, and I think anything having to do with and if it's in your Phil class, that's fine, an introduction to logic. At all.
Sure.
I mean, just
at any level.
Informal fallacies, whatever.
Yes.
Something.
Yeah.
Just the basic law of non-contradiction would be nice.
Right. Right.
You know, I was disheartened last year when in an airport I picked up a book on 100 ideas that must die, and the law of non-contradiction was in there.
Oh, goodness.
As well as falsifiability, the need for proposed falsifiability.
Yeah.
I thought, like,
really?
Where are we? Anyway, that's a whole other thing.
Well, if this goes, it shifts to power, which ought to be truly frightening.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. When reason stops, it shifts to power. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our sort of walk through sensible Christianity and the topics in sensible Christianity. I think over the next show or the next couple of shows, we'll try to do a little bit on various world religions and how they see some of these things as opposed to Christianity.
If I can close with one thing, again, I've said this before, every parish should have the audio series Sensible Christianity in the church library to be checked out by anybody who's interested. That audio series was given in city after city after city after city by Dr. Montgomery long ago, and it's dedicated or centered on the laity, not the professional theologian. It's a basic training in evidential Christianity, or an evidential approach to knowing that Christianity is true, and it's lay-oriented, not for the pros. The pros are welcome, but it was the laity who attended it. And just a plea, that would be a wonderful purchase for the church library.
Yeah, our listeners would have gotten a pretty decent sample of it a couple weeks ago when we aired the whole 30 minutes on the problem of evil.
Yeah.
So if that's something that you found helpful.
Yeah.
I'd say we have it so reasonably priced at shop1517legacy.com that if your parish won't buy it for the parish, it's at the point where individuals can buy it and be very satisfied with it and have their friends listen to it. I mean, heck, start a study group at your church, invite people over to your house and go through a section and then talk about it.
Sure, and we've got outlines available for each one of the discs.
It's absolutely worthwhile. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back again next week.
Well, before we go, just want to remind everybody that we are still open to receiving questions for the episode we will do on our 1-year anniversary episode. So if you have questions for us on any topic that we've covered this year, or maybe topics that we haven't touched, if you could sum those up in about a paragraph or less, that would be fantastic. And I will try to include those and ask the fellows live on a show so that you guys can kind of have your voices heard.
I may add the one that's been sitting in my inbox to 3 weeks and just do it on the show.
All right, great. See you next time.